There are few characters that have left an impression on the mind of video game players around the world quite like Ezio Auditore. To this day, he's still the crown jewel protagonist of the Assassin's Creed franchise, and the only character we've seen literally from birth to death. We have lived through his victories, his defeats, his pain, and his glory. The Ezio trilogy to me is, without dispute, one of the best game trilogies in the industry. It holds such a level of depth and care for the universe that it's set in, and it transformed Assassin's Creed into a global brand so naturally that it's actually difficult to truly appreciate the magnitude of its impact, especially so many years down the line. Ezio's story is expansive and long, unfolding beautifully across 3 games, filled with heartbreak, heroism, and an epic adventure. And it all begins with the sequel that set a new standard: Assassin's Creed 2. In this video, I'm going to discuss how you can play as a lore-accurate Ezio during the period of his life in Assassin's Creed 2. As you probably know by now, I really believe that this is a very fun way to play or replay some of the best games in the franchise. By imposing restrictions and challenging yourself to play immersively in every sense of the word, I think that the fun factor and the replay value increases exponentially. I'm going to give you some of my thoughts on how to best go about this for AC2, but if you have some of your own, feel free to comment down below. Now, this is a slightly different video because this game spans 2 fucking decades of his life. The story begins when Ezio is 17 years old and ends when he's in his 40s. So there's going to be some variation in gameplay depending on where you are in his story, mainly because he changes as a protagonist throughout the game. He changes a lot in those 2 decades, and some of the gameplay mechanics we choose to use or not use will be influenced by this change. Overall, however, this will be a version of Ezio that is most flamboyant, angry, and juvenile when it comes to his gameplay. There are a lot of things I think you won't have known about the gameplay of Assassin's Creed 2 that I'm going to show you that can help you play more immersively, and I'm also going to include a lot of channels and resources in the description that you should check out at the end of the video from people who know much more than me about this game and that you should definitely look into. But before we get into the gameplay aspects, we need to understand who Ezio is at this point in his life.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
At best, may it never change.
And may it never change us.
Ezio's story is one marked by tragedy. I don't actually think people realize how tragic Ezio's story is. Obviously, Assassin's Creed 2 is quite obviously and on-the-nose tragic, but by the time he reaches Revelations, a lot of players who really spend time thinking about Ezio's story kind of see that the one word you would use to describe Ezio's story is tragedy. He is born to a wealthy family in Florence and is mostly shielded from the dark realities that his assassin father Giovanni has to handle both in his public and private life. Most of his personality and skills are a product of his active and mischievous youth. You probably remember the introduction to Assassin's Creed 2, and you know that Ezio, for most of his youth, was a bit of a scoundrel. His parkour, his taunting, and the arrogant way that he fights, his creative use of the environment and conflict, all comes from the trouble he brewed and escaped from during his youth. This is one of the reasons movement will be a big element of how we play with Ezio, but it's also going to be an element that we don't change that much during the game. I told you before that because this game spans so many years, a lot of the other things that we do are going to change, like the stealth and combat, but parkour for the most part you want to keep the same, because when we pick up as Ezio in Assassin's Creed 2, he already is a master of parkour in the full sense of the word. We will try to be stealthy for the most part, but don't be afraid of shaking things up and stirring up trouble, because Ezio was never afraid of a fight, and he can handle multiple opponents at once, and this becomes more and more true the older that he gets. Also, just knowing that you can easily rise to the rooftops and use the streets of Venice or Florence as your personal playground kind of gives you a lot of flexibility if you do want to back away from a fight once you have started it. Ezio's personality and outlook mature significantly over Assassin's Creed 2. At the start of the game in 1476, 17-year-old Ezio is headstrong, cocky, and eventually revenge-driven after the execution of his father and brothers. He feels a lot of anger and a lot of sadness and a lot of frustration that he doesn't know how to control or how to process. Before the death of his family when he's young, he begins as a brash brawler who doesn't shy away from street fights or flaunting his status. Early in the game, we also see Ezio's ignorance with regards to the secret world that lies beneath the surface. He's still, for the most part, a spoiled rich kid with presumptions about reality that will very soon be shattered. In Sequence 1, for instance, Ezio looks down on thieves and courtesans, trusting the noble class much more, which is a mistake that costs his family dearly. This mistrust of the lower classes is something that Ezio is going to slowly unlearn, and you have to keep that in mind when you're playing as Ezio throughout the game. It means that you can use courtesans and thieves with higher regularity later in the game compared to earlier, since his perception of the world and how he associates himself with non-nobles slowly changes over the story. Ezio, for the most part, you have to understand, has a worldview that's very understandable for a Florentine noble at the time. He's gonna take a while to break the prejudices and assumptions he has about the world, even after he sees the tragedy that comes with the choices he made. He trusted a nobleman because he's been raised to trust the higher class over the lower class, and that led to the betrayal of his family. And then he was helped by thieves and courtesans and people who were helping the assassins, but even then it's going to take a while for him to kind of learn to live and thrive and trust in this kind of underworld that he probably just looked down upon throughout most of his youth. So his perception of the world and how he associates himself with non-nobles is slowly going to change over the story and therefore over your gameplay. As the plot advances and Ezio experiences loss and hardship, he learns humility and leadership. Right around the middle of AC2, Ezio starts giving his assassination targets a respectful final right, the famous
Requiescat in pace.
And that shows that he's starting to adopt the Assassin's Code of Honor, which is to respect your enemy in death. This is a key moment for me that highlights the growth. The perfect example of this is after Ezio kind of impulsively taunts and disrespects a defeated enemy, Vieri di Pazzi, his uncle Mario scolds him, and he says, "You are not Vieri, do not become him," prompting Ezio to treat even enemies with respect. And this is a very important shift in how you're going to manage your gameplay. You have basically a clean divide between the first half of the game and the second half of the game. In the first half, Ezio is angrier and more arrogant. This is an Ezio where you can more often use the taunt mechanic during combat, you can be more ruthless with your kills, and you can spend time disarming guards and using their own weapons against them, which was a new mechanic they implemented in this game. You can overall kind of be a dick and be more disrespectful to your enemies. But once Mario confronts Ezio and that introspection begins in the story, you want to slowly move away from that, opting for stealth or at least using your hidden blade or your sword in combat. You want to kill targets efficiently, not throwing them off buildings or using their weapons against them. Again, this isn't black or white. Ezio is still, pretty mischievous throughout his whole life. He's just a charming character, so don't be afraid of using those mechanics of the earlier game in the later game every now and then. You just want to use them less often as Ezio becomes a more responsible and respectful assassin. Over 2 decades of in-game time, Ezio evolves from a very vengeful youth to a wise, soon-to-be mentor. One of my favorite scenes in the entire game actually comes from the Bonfire of the Vanities DLC, where a 38-year-old Ezio delivers an inspiring speech to Florentines about choosing your own path. He reflects on how vengeance nearly consumed him in his youth, and to me it's a very important speech that if you haven't played the DLC or you haven't watched in a while, I implore you to go and watch, because it's just a perfect way of reflecting Ezio's character growth throughout the game. By the end of Assassin's Creed 2 in 1499, Ezio is no longer just seeking personal revenge. He understands he has a role in a much larger fight for freedom. He's fully just become an assassin, and he's ready to fight the Templars. This character growth should influence your gameplay choices in a lore-accurate run. Early on, as I mentioned before, you might want to play more recklessly as Ezio would, while later sequences you probably want to favor more restraint and stealth that benefit a seasoned assassin. Try to understand when you play the game where Ezio is at in terms of age and where he is emotionally as well. From the cutscenes and the dialogue, slowly try to understand who the man is currently, and slowly remove things that might be overly flashy or disrespectful in terms of mechanic from your gameplay, and start introducing more subtle social stealth, allies from the underworld, and efficient takedown strategies. So let's dive a little deeper into the 3 pillars of Assassin's Creed gameplay: parkour, stealth, and combat, now that you know how Ezio evolves as a person throughout the game. And let's see how we want to adapt each to Ezio's character. But before that, as most of you know, these lore-accurate videos take more time and resources to make than the average video, which is why I'm grateful for today's sponsor, Xmod. If you're watching this video, it probably isn't your first time playing Assassin's Creed 2, and there are a few grindy things that you aren't as excited to do the second or third time around as you were the first time, especially when you want to focus on the story and the narrative. Xmod is an amazing modding tool that unlocks thousands of free cheats, mods, and trainers for your favorite PC and single-player games, including Assassin's Creed 2. This platform supports over 5,000 PC games, from AAA titles to indie favorites. It works seamlessly with popular games like GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption, and as I mentioned, all of the Assassin's Creed games. It also gives you day one access to trainers for the latest games that are coming out, so probably for Assassin's Creed Shadows this is going to be the case, and you can create custom cheats that are tailored for each game's mechanics. All you have to do is download it for free, open it up on your computer, and search for whatever game you want to link for the Xmod platform. So if you're ready to take your gaming to the next level, click the link in the description to download Xmod for free and start unlocking your game's full potential. This is going to be a huge addition to the Assassin's Creed 2 lore accurate run, so I am very grateful that they offered to sponsor a video like this out of all the videos they could have. So let's start with the parkour. As I mentioned, parkour is the element of the gameplay which we're going to change the least, though I do have some things to say about it that are probably going to make some people in the community a bit upset. From a narrative perspective, Ezio has mastered parkour before he became an assassin. Before we even play as him, he's already mastered parkour because the first time we're playing as him, we're racing through the streets, climbing buildings, and eventually climbing a huge tower with your brother. It's the first real mechanic outside of fist fighting that we're introduced to, and there is no progression in the parkour elements like there is in AC1. Ezio doesn't develop any new skills or any new abilities. The only exception to this is the climb leap that Ezio is taught later on with the thieves, but for the most part, Ezio is pretty much a parkour expert by the time that we play as him, which fits with his mischievous character and the kind of absolute tomfoolery that he probably got up to in his youth. I wouldn't be surprised if his father secretly tried to teach him some of the assassin skills without introducing him to that world completely, but it's also obvious that Ezio would have had a great intrinsic motivation in developing some of these acrobatic and athletic skills the way he did because of the kind of lifestyle he led as a rich, spoiled kid. From a mechanical perspective, the Ezio trilogy has the most accurate and polished rendition of parkour within the Assassin's Creed franchise. To this day, it's still the best. And you combine that with level design that borderlines on genius, and this is the perfect game to get good at parkour, to increase your skill and be able to express yourself through Ezio. And you want to weave that into every aspect of Ezio's gameplay. You want to run away from guards when you get detected. You want to stalk guards with it when you're tailing. Use it to get from one mission to another, never touching the ground. You want to use it to find points of interest and orient yourself, to gain advantage, break line of sight. The rooftops are your friend in this game because to Ezio they always were. You can also use the added autonomy the system gives you to test yourself and try to get better at the system as you progress through the story. I do imagine that as Ezio gets older, he naturally starts developing quicker and more efficient ways to rise to the rooftops. So try and incorporate things like button discipline to jog through the streets and only sprint when you need to, learn to react quickly during a fall to catch ledge, and perhaps try some side and back ejects to add some dimensionality to your gameplay and also be more efficient when you're rising up. I encourage you to think of how Ezio would look at the architecture of the city. Look at the way he would find paths within the chaos, the way he does in the cinematic trailer when he's chasing his target, and try and replicate it. Now here comes the unpopular opinion that some people might not like. I do think there is a limit to how technical you want to be with the parkour before it stops being lore friendly. There are AC players out there so advanced and skilled at this parkour system that it honestly just looks like a bot is controlling Ezio. And it makes for some insane looking choreography that I could never be skilled enough to do, and I do implore you to look at some of these channels to see what can be done with this movement system. However, not all of it looks all that believable or natural, and it's more about focusing on pushing the game to its limits in unneeded ways when you're focusing on the narrative. I will link some channels that have amazing Ezio trilogy parkour though, just because it's cool to watch. But now for the purposes of immersion, getting good at catch ledge, button discipline, and side ejects and back ejects will be more than good enough for you to play as an older Ezio that we see in the game. So let's move on to stealth. Now, stealth is a tricky one. Assassin's Creed 2 follows AC1 in terms of its focus on movement and line of sight as core pillars of your stealth toolkit, and adds many tools that give you a lot of variety in terms of kills and ways to evade or disable enemy perception. You want to be using all of them as you unlock them. Another thing that AC2 greatly expanded on is social stealth, which we're going to touch on later. Stealth should be the main way you look to play this game, as again, Ezio was an assassin that, although not afraid for a good fight, was incredibly talented at what he did, and he adopted a serious personality during the missions that his normal charming self wouldn't uphold outside of those missions. So when you are doing a mission, you want to be more focused and serious the way that Ezio would be. For lore accurate purposes, the core thing you want to change over the course of the game is how involved you are with the factions available to you, that is mercenaries, thieves, and courtesans. As I mentioned before when we were discussing who Ezio is as a person, when Ezio is young at the start of the game and in the earlier sequences, you want to use them less, relying more on yourself to complete missions, perhaps bribing speakers to reduce notoriety since Ezio would have already understood at a very early age what money can do to influence the public perception. But Ezio does take time to trust and learn to rely on a group of society he probably spent most of his life ignoring and perhaps even villainizing. However, as missions and time go by and you are introduced to more of the cast of characters and Ezio matures, begin leaning into these social stealth mechanics much more. You want to hire mercenaries to help you in a battle or start a battle for a distraction, walk with courtesans to slip past guards, and use thieves to lure guards away from entrances. The strength that Ezio has when he is older is not just that he becomes more prolific with combat and stealth, but that he learns to utilize the city against the Templars. I encourage you to do the same. Social stealth is a huge element of what defines Ezio through the game, so make sure to use that as much as you can. When it comes to regular stealth, you can also use high-profile stealth outside, like doing running assassinations on guards on a rooftop, but try to keep things low profile when completing missions indoors, since it's probably going to reduce your chance of being detected. Now, before we move into combat, there is something that's not very well known within the greater Assassin's Creed community that a lot of people that I look up to and that I learn from have discovered and explored in this game. Between stealth and combat, there is a grey zone in which you can truly feel like the Ezio that becomes the feared assassin towards the end of Assassin's Creed 2. This is the Ezio that becomes a legend that people whisper that Templars are afraid of, and that is the legend that we know today. And it's basically, this basically revolves around a set of very obscure mechanics discovered and perfected by people like Leo K, Canography, and Brox, among other people. People in the community like these Chads understood that AC2 has a pretty fleshed out morale and fear system that Ubisoft just didn't really communicate at all. As you can see here in this chart that I'm posting, guards have a certain level of morale that varies depending on what kind of unit they are. So you can see that basic guards have a morale of 20, archers have a morale of 30, agiles 40, seekers 80, and brutes 1000. And you can also see in this other chart here that there is a set of events that will add or reduce morale to those guards. Now, I got this information from Brock's YouTube guide, which I encourage you to watch. It's going to be linked in the description below, and I honestly just encourage you to binge his entire channel because not only is he an amazing Assassin's Creed player, but he's also just a lovely person. Using these charts and understanding them, you can start making decisions in line with how Ezio would strike fear into the units that you encounter. Because essentially, if you reduce the morale of the guards to 0, based on the morale values that you've seen in the chart, the guards will start trembling and eventually run away, and they'll be extremely easy to kill and chase down. And that's just going to add this immersive factor that you probably didn't have before because this is a very obscure mechanic and part of the game. For example, killing a brute is going to reduce morale by 30 points, making all of the basic guards and all of the archers run away in fear. So this fear state does make them run, it's basically what it's meant to do, but they take a few seconds to do so, in which they're in a state of shock and awe, which is a mechanic that we kind of understand in AC1 that allowed you to create a chain of assassinations because guards start trembling and you can freely come up and stealth kill them even though you've been detected. The same thing can be done here, and you can quote-unquote stealth kill guards after you've been detected because they are so scared of Ezio that they won't fight back. So I do encourage you to explore this mechanic and try and learn what kind of guards will be afraid of what, because that will let you create a strategy of how Ezio would tackle a certain group of guards, usually by making sure you kill the brute first. And it's just so lore accurate, because if you imagine just being a regular guard and some hooded guy in the middle of the night hunts down the strongest, tallest, and most powerful of all your friends, you're probably going to shit yourself and run. And this whole idea of being this terrifying assassin that people feel powerless against, even though he's only one man, is very much how Ezio ends up being by the end of Assassin's Creed 2. So make sure to use those charts and refer back to them whenever you can. So that's stealth/combat. Let's move on to regular combat. Combat early on, you kind of need to be a dick. You make sure to taunt the guards, disarm them, be violent, be cocky, overconfident, and have very little regard for the fact that these are human beings. You know, be a regular old video game protagonist. I would take heavy inspiration from the E3 demo and how Ezio is presented there. I don't know why the E3 demo just screams Ezio to me so much. It just shows so much personality, so I would go back to that and try and emulate the way that the developers play as Ezio. Also, there are a lot of YouTube channels like The Execution Producer who will teach you some of the more advanced combat techniques in order to truly get the most out of the combat system. However, again, as you progress, like Ezio, you want your playstyle to mature. That means becoming more efficient, using Ezio's iconic weapons only, like the hidden blade, the sword, and perhaps the short blade, and focus more on attack and counter-attack playstyle, using a couple tips and tricks there from the channels that you can watch later on. Towards the end of the game, begin to factor in tools, as Ezio becomes more like the Ezio we'll get to know in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, who's just like a maxed out beast. Use smoke bombs, throwing knives, poison darts, and the hidden gun. The hidden gun and throwing knives are probably my favorite. Hidden gun just because it's badass, but also it does reduce morale a lot. And throwing knives because you can charge them and cause a lot of damage, and also you just feel like a cool Italian ninja. So that's combat. It's pretty straightforward, but you want to make sure that you pay attention to how you change your gameplay style and what tools you use and what weapons you use over others as Ezio matures and gets older. Now, there's an additional thing I want to talk about, which is fashion. What outfits and capes do you want to use? Well, all of the outfits within Assassin's Creed 2 are lore accurate, and there's only really two things that you want to pay attention to when it comes to the way you dress and the way you present Ezio. First is, pay attention to the cape you wear in each city. These capes will affect your notoriety, and Ezio very quickly becomes conscious of the world he lives in and who he is to different political sides. He lives in Renaissance Italy, so he understands how political allegiances and remaining anonymous when he wants to be can help his cause more than hinder it. So he adapted to the highly political world and managed to do that to survive. So wear the capes that were given to him in accordance with who you want to be in league with. The plain cape is the one that's available after acquiring his father's robes and has no real effect on notoriety, but then you have the Medici cape, which was gifted to Ezio by Lorenzo de' Medici, and if you wear it in Florence and Tuscany, you can be incognito. Although, remember, if you do high-profile actions and suspicious behavior, guards will react. Then you have the Venetian cape, which makes you incognito in Venice and Romagna. So depending on where you are, you want to change the capes to remain incognito as much as possible, because that's exactly what Ezio would do. Now, the second crucial thing you want to pay attention to is the greatest special outfit of any game ever since God made Earth. That is Altair's armor. This is unlocked after you collect all of the seals, and it is the canon outfit that Ezio wore towards the end of the game and the start of Brotherhood. To maximize the lore accuracy of your playthrough, make sure to get the seals as soon as you can, and begin wearing this outfit for as much of the game as you can. I trust most of you would do this anyways, because it's just such a badass outfit, but now you have an additional reason to do so. So there you have the guide on how to play as a lore accurate Ezio in Assassin's Creed 2. If you have any tips or ideas that add or differ from mine, don't hesitate to share them in the comments. I also want to share a couple of mods that might be useful to add to your immersion. The first is the E3 version of Giovanni's robes. I don't know why, they just scream Ezio to me more than the vanilla ones that the final game had. Then you have the ultimate parkour mod that recently came out, which is just going to give you a crazy additional level of control and optionality for your parkour. And finally, when you're walking low profile down the streets, you might want to use the hood down mode to just kind of like take in the sights of Italy and have Ezio have his hood down. Lastly, as I always recommend, try and play this game with as little HUD as possible. I don't think the Ezio trilogy really lends itself to playing without a HUD at all, though some people have done it successfully, but try to get as close to that as you can while still being able to get around. If you want to see why I recommend playing Assassin's Creed without a HUD, you can watch this video now.